Daddy, does the world really need another podcast? What is a podcast? What do you even talk about? Razib Khan's unsupervised learning.
All right. So I got someone here who don't really need an introduction. It is David Shor. David, I just want to start out off the bat. You are from Miami. What area of Miami did you grow up in?
North Miami Beach. If you really want to get really detailed about it, Golden Beach. It's a small municipality right below Broward County on the beach. About 600 people. Technically has co-equal status with the city of Miami. Miami itself, Miami-Dade County has something like 63 municipalities. It's very interesting because it means that you can kind of have white flight without actually needing to move. There's just kind of this history of you start with big cities, and then as non-white people moved in slowly, like the remaining white areas seceded, and I was part of the corner all the way up there, even though as a town, I think it was
Mhm.
still not majority white. There are no majority white areas in Miami-Dade County anymore.
Well, so did you grow up in an area that was heavily Spanish speaking or not? Because I know there are areas of Miami where English is really the second language.
Yeah, what I find very amusing is, the exact neighborhood that I grew up in. I think that, at the time, 25% of residents listed Spanish as their first language, while only 17% of residents listed Hispanic as their race. Basically because there were a lot of, richer, whiter Cubans in the neighborhood that I grew up in. But yeah, I think that I personally got through never speaking Spanish, but it was very hard because I uh, both it was the predominant language in like large swaths, where I was, people generally spoke English. But then I also went to Florida International University, which at the time was I think 64% Hispanic, and so you just hear a lot of Spanish around all the time.
Yeah, yeah, Florida International. That's an interesting school. It's like a big deal in South Florida and I think in Latin America, but most of the rest of the country does not know about it. So I do want to talk about that a little, but first, in terms of Spanish heritage and stuff, have you ever thought of pulling? I joke about this of pulling the BIPOC card because it is not well known that your dad is Sephardic Jewish, right?
Both my parents are
Wait,
Sephardic Jews.
both your parents are I haven't looked in your data in
Moroccan
a
Jew.
while. Yeah, I haven't looked at the data in a while, which means that I know you have Berber shift. So, just for the listeners, basically all Sephardic Jews that I've ever looked at, if you put them on a principal component analysis, they're I mean, they're not that different than European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, the traditional mainstream, but they are shifted. The Moroccan Jews are all shifted towards Berbers, which means that they must have some Berber ancestry. My hypothesis for that is the Sephardic Jews came into Morocco. They were pre-existent Berber Jews, is the only way I can say it. Probably, Berbers of the Judaic faith or something like that. These two groups fused, created the Moroccan Jews, who are genetically actually distinct from, say, the Syrian Sephardic Jews or the Sephardic Jews in Turkey, who don't have this Berber shift because they went straight from Spain to the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So, does this ever like come up? Like, I know periodically people will, you know, be confused. I saw something once, I think, where someone didn't know that they existed anymore.
Yeah, no, it's definitely funny, and I do want to talk a little bit about the Berber shift, just because there's some really interesting intra-Jewish, intra-Moroccan Jewish, I guess racism that I always heard about from my parents and grandparents, and so I'd love to delve into that because it gets a little bit into exactly what you're talking about. But in terms of my personal history, when my mom came to the U.S., she had no real background or knowledge of America's racial history. And when I was in kindergarten, they were asking, "What should you mark in the race?" She just wanted to know what box should she mark, because she was born in Africa and her had a Spanish surname and spoke Spanish and all was a colonial subject, and so she wasn't really 100% sure. And the school actually encouraged encouraged her to mark me as Hispanic, which is what I was in my administrative records growing up. I think because the school had an incentive, I think they get a little bit more money, some way or the other. But then, just to be 100% clear, once I don't know, was like 15 or something and was able to check the box on my own, then I've been checking white. I think there's a very clear case that I enjoy. I have very white skin. I have all the social capital.
Well, I
I
mean,
have all of the
I
aspects,
I think
of white privilege.
the term of art is white presenting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
you are a white Hispanic.
Yeah. I'd say I shouldn't, to be clear, I'm a big I do support affirmative action in most forms, and I also think that I realistically shouldn't benefit from it. But it is like something funny that I think about, where my mom's last name is Toledano, which means she's from Toledo. It's a very straightforwardly Hispanic surname, and sometimes I think like, and the funny thing about it is that my actual last name, Shor, shouldn't shouldn't be my last name. My dad actually changed it when he came to Israel in order to seem more Ashkenazi, and so it's funny that the incentives changed a little bit. When he was in Israel, it really made a lot of sense to not present as Spanish descending, in elite contexts. But now the incentives in some situations are slightly different.
Well, I mean, Ezra Klein doesn't pull this out very much, but his dad is Brazilian, but an Ashkenazi Jew, and so he's technically Latino as well. I mean, this stuff is I don't know why it is. I feel like in the elite, maybe intelligentsia, I feel like a lot of the boundary condition people are pushed in terms of like you see a lot more of them. Whereas, like the people that, the whole Rio Grande Valley conversation, most people in the media don't really know people that live in Brownsville, or they don't have anyone in their social network that lived in Brownsville. My son just came into the room. I'm gonna have to edit this out. Um, anyway, so anyway, what I'm getting at there is I think like the current discussion around the voting patterns have made salient the reality of like the artificiality of the borders of this construct, which obviously isn't totally artificial, but as I'm asking you whether this was a Spanish dominant city, I kind of implicitly was assuming you would be the outsider, even though you know you're a Sephardic Jew, which literally means Spanish Jew, right?
Yeah, as long as I didn't, open my mouth, I think I look relatively Cuban, and so I think that was there were lots of people with very light skin in Miami, but I do think it was like a real, it definitely impacted, I think how I see the physics of race relations, in that, it's a really interesting thing about Miami is that Miami-Dade County is 13% non-Hispanic white, and so, for the most part, white people, or at least people who, the census would consider white, largely don't have that much political power. To be clear, they have disproportionate political power. They get a lot. They get a lot more from that for that 13% than other groups would. But there's still lots of problems, and there's still lots of racism, and there's still lots of childhood poverty, and so it doesn't it gives you a somewhat different perspective, just because I grew up in a place where it's one of the few places in the world where I think, well, not the world, but in the country where white people aren't
Yeah.
unambiguously in charge. I mean, to be clear, people who are in charge, might be Cuban doctors or something, and they're
Yeah.
still white in some way. So this doesn't like
Yeah.
invalidate things, but I think it does show that the world is a complicated place.
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, we have this weird thing where Spanish surname or a Portuguese surname makes you a person of color. So for the international listeners, that's what I'll make clear. The reason I want to ask you about Miami is, multiple people who I know from Miami, academics mostly that I know, often have Latin American background. They talk about growing up in Miami, and obviously they speak English just like you speak English. Even if they spoke in a predominantly Spanish, I mean, they know English, but they talk about how it's kind of like the United States feels like a foreign country sometimes when they first leave. Did you feel that?
I think that there were some weird things, when I left for the first time, and started hanging around, I think, regular white people, so to speak. That there were like some culture shocks, like learning what almond milk was, or meeting people who meeting educated white people who were really really into politics. That was like a little bit of a culture shock, just because I spent my elementary, middle, and high school in like I think 15% white school, where most of the white kids who were there were either Russian Jewish or Israeli, or maybe normal American Jewish, and then going to a college which was mostly I'd say middle class and lower middle class Hispanic people. And so like when I was 20 and moved over to Chicago in the Obama campaign, that was really like my first introduction in a lot of ways to like standard affluent white liberal culture. And there were like little shocks. I'm sure it wasn't too crazy, but it was definitely there.
Well, so what was it like going to Florida International? Because it is, I mean, the name of the university kind of tells you, like, it has an international orientation. There's a lot of people from Latin America there. Just like, what was going to college in a university that kind of has a reputation of being almost, I mean, I'm not saying this pejoratively, but almost like in a foreign university in the United States. It's like studying abroad, kind of, is the way people describe it to me.
Yeah, I mean there are 40,000 students, so it's a really large school. It is predominantly you get a lot of people from Latin America, though it is also I think there's a couple thousand people from Pakistan, and so there are a lot of people, but it was like mostly Latin American. And yeah, I think it was really interesting. I think less about the international flavor. I think it is like relatively representative of Miami and South Florida in general. And I'd say the thing that was, really interesting, I think in some ways I'm really glad I did it, was that I really had a lot of, I think, exposure to a lot of things that I otherwise wouldn't have if I had done, the traditional get into a selective school and move out to, I don't know, the Northeast or something. But the weirdest thing was that I started in FIU when I was 13, and so there are limits to my ability of introspection. But I was there from 13 to 17. I try my best to be observant, but I don't know how much teenagers can assess the situation around them. But what I would say is it was legitimately really eye opening. I know this sounds corny to just kind of see what university is like for people who aren't at the very top tier of the educational spectrum, where I think that people write a lot about the struggles of like people who go to Harvard or people who go to even University of Michigan, but going to like at the time a relatively non-selective state school and seeing like the very concrete ways in which people have to like work in order to pay their credits, and or if they drop a class they're out thousands of dollars, and then also just kind of seeing some of the ways in which class does actually matter. I'd say like in my math department, I think for FIU had like 40,000 students and maybe like 20 math majors or something like that. And what was really interesting is that you have this group of people in this math department who are all very smart but generally from lower class backgrounds. And that's a rare thing for it's not a rare thing overall, as we both know, but like it's very rare to have a group of people that are all lower socioeconomic status but also like very smart. And like watching some of the stuff that they went through, there was stuff like out of wedlock marriage and other things that would have been like totally unheard of in like a not out of wedlock marriage, out of wedlock birth, that would have been totally unheard of in like a Harvard math department, but were common at FIU because people came from different social backgrounds. And so watching how all of that played out and what happened to everyone, I think was just super interesting. It's giving me a different perspective than if I went to some
Yeah.
selective school.
Well, so I actually just Googled this out of curiosity. So Florida International University, the median family income of a student is 57,000, which is, I mean, that's pretty close to the median. I think it might be a little bit below the median, but cost of living issues,
Hmm.
and then so I think it's about the median, and then 24% come from the top 20%. So yeah, you're right. It's very, very like representative. I want a subgroup of people that I think you might resemble in some of the experiences I've heard is very, very bright students that go to Brigham Young University, because Brigham Young University is much more representative of the Mormon community because they're so collective oriented, where they will pass up elite selective schools to go to BYU, and so the student body is much more socioeconomically uh, and I guess like professionally from their family backgrounds diverse than is common in other schools where there's more sorting and stratification going on. So I think that's a very interesting phenomenon, and you know. Uh, I always ask my friends in like, PMC, professional managerial class backgrounds, what they think the median income in the United States is for the households, and they're always off by like probably twofold, because they think the average middle class family is like in the mid 100s, 150,000 or something, and they are very out of touch. And partly in the United States, it's kind of a weird situation. I feel we're really obsessed with money and professional success, and the question that we ask is, what do you do? At least if you're a professional managerial class, and yet we don't also explicitly talk about it. And so I think it can give people, especially non-quantitative people, a sort of delusion about the distribution out there.
Yeah, it's something I'm really grateful for. My university did FIU became more selective after the recession, just because smarter kids couldn't afford to go out of state, and so that was like a really interesting thing to see because it happened on my very last year, and you could really visibly see the difference between 2008 and 2009. Down to people wearing nicer clothes and everything, which is kind of crazy. So it was actually at some point, even poorer. But I think that this quantitative thing you talk about, like, I'm really happy I had that experience just because people do really live in a bubble. And to be clear, I think I now live in a bubble. I live in right above East Village and Manhattan, and most of the people I hang out with I mean, they're all college graduates. Most of them identify as socialists. Like, it's not remotely representative. But that's why it's really important, I think, to actually go through and look at these statistics and realize what people's lives are actually like, because otherwise you can end up with a really skewed sense of things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you an anecdotal story where it's like, living in Austin. Again, it's very. When I first moved here, I got stuff off Craigslist, and I was getting furniture from people that lived in parts of the Bay Area that I had lived in, and we would kind of compare notes about like our experiences living there, and it was just really strange because it's like, okay, I'm in Texas now, but I'm seeing the exact same people I actually saw when I lived in California because we're all California refugees. And at a party once, I met a girl who grew up on the border, and she worked at Uber. And I remember talking to her for a long time because I was like, "Yeah, I've lived in Austin for a year now, and you're the first person I've met who's from the border zone." But that's a lot of people in Texas, actually, a lot of Tejanos, but I actually don't meet those people. And another thing is I don't hear Southern type accents, Texas accents, uh, in Austin. Very rarely. Like sometimes in service sector jobs, but even there, like at the higher end restaurants, you don't hear it. But then once you kind of go towards the edge of town, all of a sudden they start showing up. So these kind of like symbolic signs of who you are and where you're from just kind of like permeate your life in a way where you don't even think about it until you're having to confront about it. Like I literally had an experience where I was in North Austin once, and someone spoke to me in a strong Southern accent, and I was really confused why they spoke like that here. And then I realized, wait a second, I live in Texas now. It's like my bubble was just like so intense that wasn't clear to me. Now, I do want to talk, like, let's go back to the Sephardic Jewish aspect. So, um, you're this 13-year-old kid who went to Florida International University. That's pretty weird. But you're also in this small minority of American Jews where, so just to set the context for the listener, most American Jews are out of an Ashkenazi background where it's like, oh yeah, there are German Jews, there's Hungarian Jews, there's Polish Jews, there's Russian Jews, there's Litvak Jews. But really, they're all the same group, and the recent differentiations are over the last couple of centuries due to national borders, and it depends on the level of assimilation to the subnational culture. But they all kind of come out of this Central European Jewish matrix, and you can look at it genetically; they're very similar. There's like slight differences, but they're very difficult to tease out. So it's very, very distinct from, say, Jews from Morocco or Yemen or Iraq. Jerry Seinfeld his mom is a Syrian Jew, and the Syrian Jews are very, very endogamous. There's this particular community in Brooklyn. It's a totally different scene than the dominant Ashkenazi, just Jewish ethos and culture in the United States, just because the origins are so different. What is it like being a Sephardic Jew? And like, I mean, I'm assuming you have to explain it sometimes because people will just assume that you have. I mean, you're a Jewish American, and I mean, I know Ashkenazi Jews that look like you, so it's not like you look that distinctive. Like you could be various ethnicities. Do you like have to explain it to people? Are they surprised? I'm assuming that they're mostly interested, especially if they're Jewish. My personal experience with Ashkenazi Jews is they're a little fascinated by Sephardic Jews, and in a somewhat almost creepy way, but they mean well.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think that it's not something that people have generally heard of. I think that it's like what I find really interesting is that in Israel, Moroccan Jews specifically are the largest ethnic group. They have Shas. It's like a ethnic Moroccan religious party, and it's the fourth largest political party. Amusingly, the head of Shas, Arya Deri, is also my third cousin, which I find very, very amusing. But I think that I talk to Americans, yeah, no one's ever really heard of it. And I think what's interesting is that there are millions, literally, I think there's like a million Moroccan Jews in Israel and very, very few here. And what I find like culturally really interesting about that is that in Israel, there are a bunch of stereotypes about Moroccan Jews that in a lot of which are negative, to be clear. And when you come to the U.S., people just literally don't know about that at all. And so it's a really interesting thing where I think, both of my parents, as my mom especially, grew up in overwhelmingly Ashkenazi part of Israel. And at the time, there was very heavy cultural suppression of Sephardic culture, where you know my grandparents were afraid to speak Arabic, which was their native language. It was like a Moroccan Judaic Arabic situation, and she felt very ashamed of the culture. And even though she could probably pass as white, there was just like a lot or pass as Ashkenazi, there was just like a lot of discriminate, a lot of, I guess, this felt discrimination. And it was also just super interesting, just the way that my dad's family and my mom's family like processed it differently. They grew up in very different parts of Israel. My mom grew up in Haifa just because my grandmother, showed up at like the resettlement camp and was like, no, I'm not going to raise my kids here. And, she gave up her house and went to Haifa, while my dad grew up in kind of the periphery near the Green Line at the time in a tiny town called Chatzor near Sfat. And, what I find really interesting is that I think that on my mom's side, they really experience this discrimination very intellectually. I think that they were relatively educated. They came from Meknes in Morocco, which was like kind of this first French colonial center, but also this big rabbinical center. And I think that there was this really messed up angle in their minds, on my mom's side in the family, where they came to Israel and they were close to the top of the strata, close to the top of the ladder in Morocco. They came from a rabbinical family and they had all of the right surnames and all of this, and the Ashkenazi Jews just didn't care. I think that was something that bothered them a lot. They were still at the bottom of the social class. While my dad's family, I think, was more working class, and they show up in like kind of an immigrant ghetto. And for them, they were just really bitter that the Ashkenazi Jews kind of looked down at them for being religious. But there wasn't the same kind of there wasn't the same kind of highly intellectualized resentment, feeling that they were being looked down on or couldn't be trusted. And so very different lived experiences for discrimination, even though they're both from the same ethnic group. And that's something I think about a lot in the US when you're trying to compare what the lived experiences are of for example, disadvantaged people from disadvantaged groups who are very good at writing versus disadvantaged groups who aren't being invited to write think pieces.
So many years ago, I made an offhand comment many years ago, as in like the 2000s. So I guess almost 2 decades, kind of technically. I made an offhand comment wondering whether Matthew Iglesias was a Sephardic Jew, and because he mentioned being Jewish, and his last name is Iglesias, and so lo and behold, I get an email from him, and he said, "No, it's much more boring. My paternal grandfather was Galician Cuban," and so I want to like put that out there because that's the attitude that I've experienced from American Jews, where they would think it was cool to have Sephardic ancestry. And so I think it's just an interesting contrast with, all the stuff that we do know from Israel, where you didn't get into it, but some of the ways Sephardic Jews were treated, I mean, they were called Schwarza, which I think is offensive. A term means like kind of like black or dark, and there were adoptions where some of the stuff that happened to Native Americans in the United States, where they call cultural genocide, happened to them. So
Yeah, I think the history is super interesting. Just my grandfather. I mean, first, on my mom's side, when my family got there, my was kind of wouldn't give my grandfather a job, but was giving like Polish people a job. And there's like lots of really good music at the time, protesting it. I think my some members, but what I think is fun about it is that the actual historical result is that in modern Israeli politics, Sephardic Jews are very right wing, and Ashkenazi Jews are very left wing. And obviously at this point, like a third of the country is mixed. There was a lot of mixing, but and they're somewhere in between. But I think it's a really interesting thing, and it reminds me a little bit of Taiwan, where you have this very, very intense domestic political dispute that seemingly is tied to some external foreign policy issue. With China, with Taiwan, it's obviously the relationship with China, and Israel, it's like what being pro peace versus being versus wanting to be hawkish against Arabs and Palestinians. And what I think is super interesting is that even though that's there, and even though there's all of this rhetoric, it turns out that actually it's mostly ethnic divide. In Taiwan, it's kind of Hakka versus not, and in Israel, it's very much like Sephardic versus Ashkenazi versus Hasidic versus there are like different factions because Israel's like an absurdly diverse place, but it's a very the fight is very ethnic in nature, even though it on the surface seems ideological, and that is something that
yeah,
was. I mean, I think that politics is actually, is very often like this. It's something. It's a reason I really like to follow foreign politics. Is that when you're in the U.S., you have all of these emotional attachments, to concepts like race or ideology, because you're personally very connected. But what I like about foreign politics is, if you're a little bit more disconnected, you can kind of see the parts of what's going on. And it's why I like following, even African politics. It really like gives you a sense of how ethnicity ends up bleeding into ideology. And so that was kind of a rant. But the real way in which Sephardic Jews are different is that they're very, very right wing. And I think it's something that I find very interesting. My dad, for example, he's a modern Orthodox rabbi in Great Neck, and he's incredibly right wing. He hates Netanyahu from the right. I think he didn't even vote for the Defense Party. I think, and that's really common. The precinct where my dad grew up, which is overwhelmingly Sephardic. I think it's Sephardic, and recently there are some Hasidic Jews because it's spillover from Swat. And I think that all the center left parties combined in the last election combined to like 5 or 6%, and so that's something that's very different, I think, than any of the. I just think it's like inherently super interesting. I think like Israel's one of the
yeah.
only countries where now I guess it's starting to happen everywhere, but where kind of the underclass is very right wing, and I think that it's this big cultural divide where when I think about how my family talks about politics and how any of my Jewish friends' families talk about politics, it's very different.
All right. Well, I mean, oh, okay. So let's cut into I have some questions about American politics. So you're asked kind of as a candidly what Democratic operatives think. Do you know what Republican operatives think and know, but they can't tell their clients or they can't tell their base?
I'm gonna be honest and say no, but I do think there's a really interesting asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans, where both parties are run by highly educated people. That most institutions are run by highly educated people, but I think there's this real asymmetry. I think you heard me talk about this on the Hashimoto podcast, where I think that the bias of Republicans being run by their most cosmopolitan component moves them to the center. Definitely on racial issues or cosmopolitan issues, but also probably on social issues to some extent. While on the Democratic side, the people who run the Democratic Party, like the nuts and bolts of the staff, are way to the left of the median Democrat, and that pushes them away from the median voter. And I think that there's a real asymmetry there that's substantively important. And but yeah, I don't know a ton about the actual Republican operatives. Believe it or not, they don't hang out very much. Though in my experience, I've actually been very surprised at how diverse Republican operatives are. There was one conference I went to where, or I guess two, where two of the two sets of people were together, which was very strange. And I was actually like really surprised. There were lots of people of color. They were mostly young, and because that's just the reality of the industry. But I think again, it's something that pushes them toward the center. And I do think there's a real. I do think the other thing I'd say, just in terms of the symmetry, is that when I say that the winning move for Democrats is generally to decrease the decrease the salience of cultural issues and increase the salience of economic issues. For Republicans, it's the exact opposite, where American politics is, for better or for worse, mostly a game of who can win, the white working class, and the white working class is relatively right wing on cultural issues and relatively left wing on economic issues, and so on both sides, they really have this incentive. With the Democrats have an incentive to lower the salience, and I think there's a really interesting symmetry where I think the people who run the Democratic Party care a lot about social issues, and I'm not saying they don't care about economic issues, but they care a lot more about it, I think, than the median Democrat. But their day job is that they have to try to decrease the salience of cultural issues, and I think that the reverse of that, I think that when you meet people who professionally work in Republican politics, they're usually very motivated by a desire to lower taxes and liberty and all of these different things, but it's not in their best interest electorally to do that. And so I think that there's an interesting symmetry where both sets of people have to really try very hard to not campaign on what they believe in order to win. And I think if you look in 2012 is a great example where Republicans really campaigned on what they believed in, small business, owner identity politics, and all of this different stuff, while Democrats managed to hold down the fort, avoid talking about controversial things, have the most econ-focused campaign probably in 60 years, and then Democrats won. Well, in 2016, Republicans did a really good job of not promising not to cut Medicare and Social Security, not talking about any of their economic agenda, but not only talking about their social agenda, but goading Democrats into also talking about their social agenda. And so it is I think a very cruel thing about working in politics. You just have two sets of operatives who have to really not, whatever side doesn't follow their heart the most is the side that wins. And I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, that's my impression from talking to. I do know people who, I don't know, operatives. I know people on Senate staff, Republican senators. I know the staff, and they're very cosmopolitan culturally, and they're in it. They're a lot of them are out of the quote unquote liberty movement. That's how they say it, which is a super dorky way to say it, but that is what they say. And so what their priorities are from that. But on the other hand, the base is filled with a lot of people that care about these socially conservative issues. The only problem that they have now is that might not be a big enough base. And so, one of the things that I think maybe, MSNBC type Democrats don't want to acknowledge is, a lot of social issues, Trump is not, he says some socially conservative things, but he's obviously not going to move on it at all. And he's probably not even a believer in that sort of stuff. So for example, there's no talk of reversing gay marriage. There's just zero energy into that, right? That's done. So we're in a different space here. I guess a question I would have for you, and maybe you don't know because you're not a Republican operative, but all this stuff about how, it's now it's kind of fake that it's multiracial, but setting that aside, it is obviously pivoting towards a more downscale segment, even though on average, I think because the Democrats have a lot of minorities that are not as well off, still the average median Republican still has a higher household income, but it's obviously shifting more downscale, becoming less the party of Romney and more. I mean, maybe Santorum, except not as socially conservative. Um, so this is the optics, but like, do you think it's like, I mean, your impression is this totally fake? Because I feel like people can't change overnight. I mean, these are the people that came up through the Koch network, and a lot of the older ones are still obsessed with Reagan. So I just wonder what the next like 4 years are going to be, where they kind of seem to have this messaging from the Trump era of more economic moderation, anti-free trade, all these things. But I mean, they spent decades like kind of promoting this stuff.
Yeah, I do think there's a Matthew Iglesias point I really like, which is that right now there aren't any meaningful budget constraints, because interest rates are so low, and so Trump didn't actually preside over, giant cuts in domestic spending. I think we have a natural experiment from Kansas. I really like to talk about, in 2018, we both Democrats lost the governor's race in Vermont, and then won a governor's race in Kansas, in a basic show that voters actually really don't like radical change. That both parties' core agendas can be very unpopular and cause electoral backlash. And so I think that if you had a situation where Republicans were actually like trying to do large cuts to programs, then it would threaten the integrity of their coalition. And we saw in our polling that Obama-Trump voters, mostly had very stable approval of Trump, the entire time. But during Obamacare repeal, there were actually substantial drops because they do disagree with Republicans on these things. And I think that the giant tax cuts for rich people don't pose the same sort of they're not really that electorally potent. I think the tax cuts were maybe slightly below water, but I think they were more popular than Trump was. And I don't think that's a big electoral liability. The only issue is that if you cut taxes, and normally you have to also cut spending. But as long as you don't have to cut spending, it's not necessarily clear that this kind of thing actually ends up mattering. But I think this broader question of what does the Republican Party become? I'm personally very skeptical that they're going to change course from here, just because. I mean, it's hard to know. Party politics is really Byzantine. Primaries are very chaotic. You first past the post, winner take all, 16 candidates. Weird things happen. Like Mitt Romney winning in 2012 was actually a very weird, very weird thing. He was almost an anti-Condorcet winner. He would have lost in a runoff in a 1-versus-1 race to almost every other person running except for Ron Paul. So anything could happen, but I do think the incentives of the Republican Party, they should be very happy with what they've put together. Maybe not morally, but they now have these very large structural biases because they've catered to they've catered their communication more to working class people, and it would be kind of silly for them to stray off. But as you said, the people who actually inhabit these institutions are not personally excited by this, and so it's totally possible to move in an electorally destructive way. I hope they do.
Yeah. Well, so here's a question. We live in a polarized atmosphere right now politically. There's some people who are saying there are no swing voters, and it's negative polarization or whatever, and it's all about turnout. So Susan Collins was reelected though, and it seems like she and Manchin and Murkowski, they're gonna kind of run the show, I think, in a way, no matter what happens. I don't know, but I mean, do you think that the U.S. There is hope for centrists in this country, and like maybe you think Biden is a centrist? I don't know. I mean, there's debates about that, right? So like we live in this extremely polarized environment where there's a lot of rhetorical, I don't know, marginalization of the other, like however you want to say it. And so the parties are getting more ideologically sorted, but there's still some centrists around. And do you think that they're just kind of just the detritus of history, or do you think that they're going to have some effect, like, as representatives of the median voter?
Yeah, in the long run, the trend over the last 30 years, it's just fewer and fewer moderates every single cycle. I think that if there was an open seat today in Maine, it's very unlikely that someone as moderate as Collins would get through. I think if you look at Manchin, there's no Democrat will ever get elected in West Virginia again, or it'll take a very long time. And so I think that the trends are all there for this to just continue. It's very hard in our electoral system. I think not just, I'm not making like a Bill Volger's law claim. I just think that, structurally, I think it's very interesting. I used to criticize the political science consensus that moderate candidates do a lot better. I thought that moderate candidates really do quite a bit better, and that the parties that moderate do a lot better. But there's almost this ideological cartel where whenever one party moves further from the center, the other party correspondingly moves further from the center, and they just kind of keep moving out. I think if you look at how this is broken down in the past, in the U.S., I'm not sure what the analog is, but in Britain, you had a situation where Labour moved so far to the left that some centrist party popped up. I think institutionally, unless there's like electoral reform, it's very unlikely that happens here. But I do think the really interesting question about the next decade is that we're now at a point where the Democratic coalition is really fundamentally not compatible with passing laws in this country, just because the Senate is very, very biased against Democrats. It's kind of a hard thing to describe because it really comes down. It's like a weird quirk of history that the map that was up in 2018, because Republicans created a lot of empty states in the 19th century, really has a lot of these highly Obama-Trump rural states, and how conservative it is really was showcased by in 2018. We had this wave Democratic year and still lost 2 seats. And if we had that election in a non-wave year or in a presidential year, we would probably lose like 5 or 6 seats. So I think there's a reasonable case that like the equilibrium number of Senate seats with our current coalition is something like 42 or 43. So even if we had DC and Puerto Rican statehood and all this stuff, it still really wouldn't be compatible with what we're doing. With being able to pass majorities. And so I don't think that there's much. If Democrats want to be in a position where they can change laws, they really do have to moderate along a bunch of different dimensions. And it's not super clear to me that they will or that they can. And so I think that's like kind of the big question is, in order for control of the Senate to be a competitive thing, the National Democratic Party, not just individual senators, but like the actual National Democratic Party has to like really move to the center on a bunch of different issues. And it's not organizationally clear to me that they're capable of doing that. Just if you look at the mechanics of why these parties move to the extremes in the first place.
All right. So I've been talking to you for a while, so I'm going to let you go after this question. So let me just ask you one last question. So you're, an operative, whatever. You're a data guy. You try to give people insights. You have some serious skin in the game because obviously, you want your candidates to win. And then in academia, you have these political scientists that have their own ideas. And, there's been a lot of controversy about how academia is getting extremely ideological. Now, I don't see that as much in political science. I see it more like, say, like the psychology of ideology, where, there's no conservative psychologist, so they write the questions in a particular way where you could tell where they're coming from. But setting that aside, I'm sure you read the political science literature, obviously, to get out, you obviously read the literature because you cite it, you tweet it, that's caused issues, right? But how do you feel about you as a data guy that looks at the data and in your work day to day versus, say, a political scientist where you guys have different officially on paper, you have different incentive structures because in academic, it's about like peer reviewed publications and, they don't have that skin in the game, whereas you do. So maybe that introduces a bias, or maybe you're more honest. Like, have you thought about that sort of thing in terms of like these different incentives and like, who you trust and who you believe? I don't personally look at political science very closely, and so I don't have a good intuition for this.
Yeah, I think personally, there's a lot of very high quality political science research out there, and a lot of what I do is I just actually try to keep up with it. and I think that gives you a lot of power. But in terms of, I think that a lot of the biases that exist are the same, for both practitioners and people in academia. I think there's like a side note that I think that when you look at the replication crisis and all this other stuff, like what's really great about actually, working in industry is that you really are graded on like the mean squared error of your forecasts. And so that really pushes you, I think, to be more honest. You're not trying to get a publication out. That said, I think the core problem with all of these things, most people who work in political science are extremely liberal, and most people who everyone who works in democratic politics is extremely liberal. And so I think that the biggest problem that both sides face is that there's a really strong cognitive bias toward ideologically convenient results. And I think that I'm not claiming it's not like what you see in anthropology or anything like that. I think there's a lot of very rigorous research. But I think there's a lot of ways in which that seeps in. One example is that people say all the time, oh, Democratic people are super left wing on issues. They agree with us on issues, but then they don't vote with us because of values. And there's I'm sure that on net, Democrats are more popular, have more popular issue positions than Republicans, maybe. But I think there's a real bias in terms of what questions end up getting written or what questions end up getting asked. And also, there's a real bias in terms of how I think that ideological bias has kind of prevented people for a long time from really thinking critically about why it is that Democrats lose elections. And I think a really big part of the reason why we lose elections is that people actually disagree with us on a bunch of, not us, but people disagree with my party on a bunch of things. And if you ask things the right way, if you have the right survey design, if you, sometimes we joke about hiring Republicans to write our questions, then suddenly things look a lot more balanced. And I think that that's something that the political science, literature is starting to catch up with. But for a really long time, I think there was this paper that basically they did this big survey and they said, oh, it turns out that politicians are really overestimating how conservative their districts are. Because if you poll all these different things on gun control or all this stuff, it's the median voter is 20 points to the left of what the these constituent what these politicians believe. And it turns out actually in retrospect the politicians are probably right. You can do a poll that says that gun control is very popular, but then when it gets on a ballot measure or it loses, or when a campaign actually campaigns on these things and they lose. And I think that that's something that's really cool about actually working in industry is I've noticed that a lot of these politicians, particularly the politicians who have been around for a long time, people from Biden's generation, these old school consultants from the 80s, they have a very good intuitive sense of politics that doesn't always align with numbers. And in 2012, I really resented them. I was like, oh, I know all this Bayesian statistics, and these people just don't understand anything. But I think if I look back, I'd say 80% of my disagreements with these old school consultants, in retrospect, I think they were right about 80% of the things. And one of the things being that actually people are a lot more conservative than some political science literature claims.
Yeah. Well, so I want to ask one last question then, because I wondered about this. So I have a friend who was commissioned to do a story for the New Yorker, and he was complaining online about the fact that Trump supporters at some rallies refused to talk to him. They wouldn't give him their names, and I messaged him and I'm like, you identified yourself as a reporter from the New Yorker. Of course they're not going to give you their names. They know that you hate them. And he's like, well, I'm trying to be objective. And I'm like, yes, but you hate them, right? And he's like, yeah, of course I hate them. And so it's I do wonder about some of the data that people are trying to get through polls or journalism, where they're trying to get, in the 2000s, a lot of us bloggers were the view from nowhere is lame, and it just seemed so staid. But now, as someone who's knows a fair number of conservatives, I can tell you it's I myself would not talk to a journalist, just because they make their views of what they think of people like me very clear, and so you just don't trust that person. And I'm relatively cosmopolitan and PMC type person, I can imagine that, like, some more working class person has an even higher level of distrust already. And so I just wonder, like, it seems like you need to, like, use, like, the techniques of cognitive psychology or some other field where you can figure out indirectly people's real views, because I mean, to be entirely frank, the hostility is, like, judging from, like, conservative intellectuals that I know, the hostility of, like, the regular people must be just incredibly out of control, and the people that you get to talk to you, they're not normal people anymore. Like, they're just really, like, probably, frankly, they're kind of, like, crazy, in terms of, like, normal people don't like to get into, like, intense ideological arguments with people they hate.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a real issue. I talked a lot about social trust and some of the other stuff I did, and it turns out that survey respondents are considerably higher in social trust, various measures of social trust, than the overall population. Um, but there's other factors, like we did a 5-factor personality test on our survey respondents once, and it turns out that survey respondents are like a standard deviation more agreeable than the overall population. And so so that's
Yeah.
it's a real problem. I think a lot of people will say, oh, we need to do focus groups, we need to do qualitative research. But the problem is that, these people aren't getting in focus groups either. It's like a very hard problem. Sometimes I
Yeah.
joke, like, we should send people out to bars, and buy people drinks. But I think, that ultimately, I think I do believe the answers to these questions are statistical in nature, even though they're very hard. But I think that something that's very helpful about having, I don't know, a real sense of the world around you is if you go to a Trump rally, you look around and you're like, none of these people would ever answer a 15-minute phone survey. That should really make you think, all right, well, what is the thing that makes these things distinctive? How do we make these people representative? Because it's a very real problem, because people who work in politics are extremely unrepresentative and very different from the median voter. And so if you can't step outside of that, then you're really screwed. That's like kind of the big problem in my industry. I think that there are
Yeah.
statistical solutions to this, but I think the problem is exactly what you laid out, which is that people who participate in quantitative or qualitative interviews are way more agreeable, way more trusting, and this shows up. It makes you really question, like, all the lockdown polling. All the lockdown polling shows every aspect of lockdown being extremely popular. But in retrospect, like, is that true? It's very plausible to me that
Yeah.
all of these people who were mad about lockdown weren't answering their phones.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with the lockdown, one thing that I noticed is it became very culturally polarized, just masks and all these other things. But when I, walk around in a blue area, um, I see a lot of parties and a lot of stuff that is non-compliant with what, you know, reporting and surveys are showing of extremely blue democratic areas. So yeah, people say one thing and they're kind of, signaling their adherence, just when they tell you or when you ask them. But I mean, the reality is people, they miss socialization, they miss all these other contacts, and they're doing it on the sly. And I know that people who have access to, you know, phone data, they see that the gap exists, but it's not nearly as extreme as you would just project from, what you would assume from what people say
I
in
mean,
the media.
I think that's true, but I'd also just really stress that I think that very large fractions of Republicans in surveys say that they're wearing masks all the time and all this other stuff, and I think that is actually might in large part just be due to non-response bias. And so I do
Yeah.
agree with what you're saying, but I think that there's a very real measurement problem. It used to not matter, but I think we're now at a point where these issues of trust and all these other psychometric issues are now very correlated with vote choice, and that's unfortunate. It used to be that all of these things were relatively. It was a lot easier to do polling when when who you voted for was mainly a question of like regional clientism. Now that it's a function of these deep psychometric traits, it's a much harder thing to actually do correctly.
Well, as we close out, I guess one thing that I can say from talking to you right now is like it might not be bad that someone who is kind of an instinctive politician like Biden is taking the helm then, because he's certainly not going to be totally trusting the data
Yeah,
guys.
I think something I really I think this is like an underappreciated point, and it's just that it's now effect sizes are so much smaller in politics than they used to be. You know, it used to be that you could do a phone survey and you could just go on the air and TV and do a phone survey before and after and figure out how it worked because these were like 6 or 7 point effects. You know, now we're at a point where showing someone 100 ads maybe is worth 1%, and that's still cost effective to do, but it's very hard to know rigorously what works and what doesn't work. And so these people who have living memory of the old days when it was possible to actually know what worked and what didn't, those things haven't changed that much. And so I think that's a big thing that Biden has at his disposal is he just has this living memory and these connections to other people who have this living memory that younger politicians don't. And I think with younger politicians, in the absence of any ability to know what works or what doesn't, you kind of get into this weird postmodernist ideology that starts to creep in.
All right. Well, let the era of good feelings roll on, I guess, right now. It's been great talking to you. We've known each other for a while. I think I can say that without getting you canceled because that's done. um, uh, that was kind of crazy. When that happened to you, by the way, a lot of people that I know were that was actually happening to in various ways, less prominent. And I was kind of freaking out that maybe it had to do with me in some weird psychic way that I didn't understand. um, you're not the only one. I mean, there were people like 1 degree from me, and I was starting to freak out. So, anyways, I'm glad that you bounced back. Obviously, you're all over. We're gonna hear from you. It was a great conversation, and let's follow up sometime.
All right, sounds good. Talk to you soon. Bye.
This podcast for kids.